The eternal debate. Crank length. Is it too long? Is it too short? Stay tuned. We'll find out. Commercially, cranks come in a varying range of sizes, starting at 160 millimeters, thanks to Shimano and SRAM, going to 165, 170, 172, and 175. Some brands, particularly Shimano, are now even carrying up to 180 millimeter crank. There are also specialists in the industry, particularly individuals like Rota, who is a Spanish brand who tends to make cranks that are below average sizing, down to kind of as little as 150 millimeters, and also ultra specialists like the fantastic Appleman over in the US, who makes cranks as little as 100 millimeters in length. We actually featured a pair of those on a good customer of ours, Giles Harrison's bike. It's an individual who suffers from a condition known as achondroplasia, which is dwarfism. We built him a full custom Sato. Just have a look at this. It was a perfect way of getting Giles the optimum crank length for his full custom bike. So generally what you'll find on most off-the-peg bikes, so a bike that comes in a box, you will usually find anywhere between 165 and 175 millimeter crank. Your average sizes, so 52, 54, 56 centimeter, will generally have 172.5 millimeter chain set, where your bigger bikes, 58, 60 centimeter, will usually have a 175. Very, very small bikes, and certainly in some of the more forward-thinking brands, Canyon, I'm looking at you here, they'll go down to as little as 165 millimeter. But if you are 5'2", 5'3", and you're pedaling a 170, it's probably not right. In bike fitting circles, it's been very common for crank length reduction to occur as a means of opening up the hips, particularly when you're reducing saddle height. As you lower the saddle height, essentially it can become more difficult for you to come through the top of the stroke. This is where crank length reduction can really come into it. So historically, this has led to some problems from a bike fitting perspective, typically resulting in excessive saddle height. Up until a certain point, the shortest commercially available crank length was about 170 millimeters. So the only way of opening up the hips was to raise the saddle height. Now, obviously, times have changed, equipment changes. We now have a much greater range and spectrum of crank lengths. So as a result, we don't really need to render such high saddle heights. Unfortunately, the kind of trend for excessive saddle height seems to have stuck. So what if your crank length is too long? Well, there are a number of issues associated with this. It isn't helped by the fact that, as we kind of talked a little bit earlier in the video, that commercially available cranks are typically a little bit too long. The crank lengths that come on bicycles are generally too long as well, in our opinion. But excessive crank length typically leads to an increase in loaded flexion of the knee. So in English, it means that the knee is more bent as you're starting to deliver power through the top of the stroke. Furthermore, at the top of the stroke, it has a tendency of impinging the hips, which means that it's more difficult for the knee to pass through the top of the stroke. So crank length reduction typically means that you don't have to raise your knee so high in order to get over the top of the stroke. So the bike fitting fraternity have been waxing lyrical about shorter cranks always being better. I've come to find this not to be necessarily true. If I had to be honest, generally speaking, yes, shorter cranks or a move to a slightly shorter crank can be better, but we've certainly found in taller individuals whereby they have much longer limbs, and if they've got good hip function, then generally speaking, a shorter crank isn't necessarily always better. There does come a point where the leverage aspect of things comes into play and the torque effectiveness of a crank comes into play. This is provided that the rider's hip function will allow for it. So what are the negatives of a crank length that's too short? Well, there are two things that we've found. Firstly, if the crank is too short, what it tends to result in is the rider sort of spilling over the crank and falling into the front of the bike. And as we've discussed in previous videos, if you've got too much weight on the front of the bike, it will negatively impact the way that the bike rides. Secondly, it can have adverse effects on the saddle interaction. Generally speaking, it will typically result in over-interaction with the nose of the saddle, usually leading to some sort of genital discomfort or saddle pressure issues. I suspect, and again, please don't take this as gospel, but this is just a suspicion of mine, is that we came about finding the benefits of crank length reduction through triathlon circles. Triathlon and time trial fitting, generally speaking, is very, very different to road cycling. Firstly, in the sense the bike handling thing kind of goes out the window because time trial and triathlon bikes don't handle very well anyway. But secondly, geometrically, time trial bikes are very, very different. The saddle is much, much further forward, mostly in the name of getting the saddle right over the bottom bracket. Sometimes when that happens, the rider adopts a different pelvic orientation. So on a road bike, pelvis is generally orientated a little bit more like so, but on a time trial bike, we're usually anteriorly rotating the pelvis like this. What that will do is impinge the hips. So this is why with triathlon fitting, it's quite commonplace to see even shorter crank lengths. And this is where you can see very, very real gains. It can result in a lower saddle height, or should I say, an inexcessive saddle height, and thus will allow you to get a shorter crank. Side effect of that is actually, because the saddle height is lower in space, there's some school of thought to suggest that that might be a little bit more aerodynamic as well, because it lowers your frontal area. The other benefit that can be had from having a reduction in crank length is it just tends to reduce or lessen fatigue through muscle groups like the quadriceps and the gastrocs, calf muscles, which can keep you fresher moving into the run leg of your race. It's worth noting that if you are going to start experimenting with crank length, it's best to do so with Bikefit, because obviously in a Bikefit we can test it. On our jig here we have adjustable crank length from 185 to 155 millimeters. But if you are experimenting at home, it's worth noting that as you reduce the crank length, you need to raise the saddle height by the same amount, mostly to keep your terminal leg extension more or less the same. So there you have it, a very simple basic crash course on crank length. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to put a comment in the comment section below. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and let's see you for the next one.